We're in the home stretch. We got 2 hours, and we're going to be discussing finishing up step 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and maybe we'll even get to 10. Because let me tell you, once you finish 4 and you do 5, you do 6 and 7 and 8 the same day that you do 5. So you're really on your road. This is the big book way. So that's the resentment form. It's a real simple form, but I can tell you that it has given tremendous serenity and insight to people who have suffered in ways that I can imagine, but I've never suffered myself. And I speak only with their experience when I say to you, it works even if you've suffered some of the most horrible experiences anyone could ever suffer. It has worked for people like you. I can't speak myself like that. I haven't suffered that way, but I know people who have in this program, and I know what they've got from these forms. The next form is the fear form. And I'm just going to go really quickly to that because it's a really brilliant form. It's found on page 27 of the book, and it's also, you have it separately. Again, if you follow the directions of the big book, you will realize that you fill out column 1 before you fill out column 2. You fill out column 2 before you fill out column 3. In other words, you make copies of this book, of this form, or you use it on the web. You can also download it and use it on your computer, not on the web, but on the computer, on your own computer. And you start off by writing out your fears. And you got a little box, and there are actually, I think, 9 boxes here. So you can write out 9 fears per page. And the fears will come from what you've already filled out in your resentment form when you filled out where you're frightened. So, I write down Hitler again. What is my fear? That there will be anti-Semitism again, or that it could happen again. But I write down Hitler. I'd write down the guy I gossiped about. I'd write down a number of things where I had some fear. I'd write those things down again. I also wrote down fears that I didn't write down in my resentment form. Fears that I didn't think about very much, but when I think about them, I have. Fears of being in the dark, fears of being alone, fears of dying. It wasn't something that I would write down in my resentment form. It's not as if I think about it all the time, I'm going to die, but when I think about it, I'm afraid of dying. Or I'm not now, but I was afraid of dying when I filled out the form. So I put down fear of death. Or death, I wrote down. And I just wrote a list of fears. They came from my resentment form as well, but they also fears in general. And I filled out, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 pages. I didn't have more than 30 fears, so 3 pages would be enough. And I wrote down the fears. Then I asked why I had the fears. That's the second column. Why do I have those fears? What's the cause? Well, from Hitler, what are my fears? That it'll happen again, that anti-Semitism will be on the rise, that other people can be killed without other people worrying about it or fearing it, that there will be other genocides of other kinds. I don't know, the guy I gossip about, that he'll find out about my gossip. That other people will not like me because I gossip, I suppose. Fears relating to death, lingering, harm to others, the pain I'd cause to people who love me, the uncertainty of knowing what happens afterwards given my lack of religious conviction. So I put that down. Fear of walking in certain parts of Winnipeg, say. Fear of getting beat up, fear of getting killed, fear of being robbed. Okay? A daughter, fear of her dying before I do. Fear of her, she may, I filled this out once when she was on a trip. One of my daughters was on a trip. Fear of never hearing from her again. Fear that she's going to get lost. Fear that she's going to get kidnapped. Fear that she's going to be taken and, go into white slavery. You can think these things, right? So I would put down those fears under column 2. Column 3 asks you a pretty simple question. Where was your trust and reliance, upon infinite God or upon yourself? That's a tough one. think it might be upon myself, because if I was trusting and relying upon infinite God, chances are good I wouldn't have that fear. So I would write down, and unfortunately, the way it reproduces on the in the book, I think it's different on the column, but the book actually doesn't have pages for infinite God or my finite self, but that's what you're supposed to write. Where is my trust and reliance on infinite God or on finite self? So if you put finite self on the right-hand side, then you'll be putting check marks down beside finite self. And these are throwaways. These are easy to do. And you go down all the way down column 3. Column 4, did self-reliance work? Well, I don't think so, because if it worked, I wouldn't feel the fear, right? So you put down under, you have a yes and a no column, and you write down under no, it didn't work. Check, check, check. I sometimes think about just getting rid of these 2 columns, because I don't know. They're so obvious. You clearly self-reliance is what you relied on, and it didn't work. So I'm not so sure that it's worth it, but it's in the big book, so we keep it in there. Then you say the fear prayer. And the fear prayer is a really brilliant prayer. God, please remove this particular fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be. Not do, but be. And what I have discovered in saying this prayer, and then the question is, what would God have you be? So when you first fill out this form, you may not have all the answers. You may not think about what God would have you be. But you say the form anyway. You ask God to remove your fear and direct his attention or its attention or her attention or whatever attention to what God would have you be. My answers to those questions come out to be so simple. I'm worried about my daughter. Let's say she's on a trip and I'm worried about what's going to happen to her. What could I be in relation to that fear? A loving father? A hopeful father? What else can I do? What good will worrying do? Am I going to go and rescue her? Am I going to go over to Europe and rescue her? No. Would she want me to rescue her? No. Is it realistic to expect that she's going to be sold into white slavery? No. A loving and honest and trusting father. She knows how to take care of herself. She's a very careful, she's a young woman. I'm going to be the best father I can be to her. And that means sometimes leaving her alone rather than doing something for her. You know, when we're going through the difficulties in her teen years, what was I as a father, what was I supposed to be? A loving and honest and direct father who did not try and meddle in her life, but did try to be honest with her and say things to her that had to be said. In relation to Hitler, what would God have me be? Truthful, loving, compassionate, and honest. And that would mean, talking to people if I saw hints of anti-Semitism or any racial discrimination of any kind, talking to them about it in a tolerant, loving, and compassionate way. Because most people are not evil. Most people become discriminators because they're ignorant of facts and of understandings. Maybe I can help them. But God wouldn't have me hate, because that is the same kind of thing that I'm asking people not to do. Right? Fear of walking in places in Winnipeg. What would God have me be? This is an interesting one. And I got my guide to that when at one point I was, must be 10 years ago, and a friend of my daughter's was organizing a parachute jump in favor of some charity. So you get pledges and you do. Well, I'd never been on a parachute, and I thought, maybe I'll do that. My wife said, "You're the only source of income in our family. You have 2 children who love you. You have a father," my mother had passed away, but you have a father who loves you. You have me who loves you. You have no right to take such a risk. I thought to myself, yeah, let's say the risk is only 2% that I'll fall, that the parachute would, maybe if it's 0.5% that the parachute would not work, and that the safety wouldn't work. But it's a risk that I don't have to take. If I was 20, maybe I'd take it. But it's a risk that I don't have to take. So I don't. So I looked at that. What would God have me be in relation to being afraid to walk in parts of Winnipeg? Well, first of all, God would have me be a careful and honest person to see whether my fear is justified. God would have me be a person who doesn't take unnecessary risks. But I'll tell you, if my 15-year-old daughter phoned me from that part of Winnipeg and said, I don't know how I got here, but please help me, you think I'd be afraid to go to that place? I wouldn't be. I'd be much more concerned about her. So suddenly my fear, which is more of a debilitating feeling, becomes a strategy for dealing with life. Does that make sense? I mean, suddenly I know what I have to be, and I can balance the different qualities, and the fear is no longer a fear, because how can I fear something that I have no control over? I can just sort of do what I can. A loving person, a compassionate person, a person ready to act if action is necessary. And what I found is that the Big Book promises that we will outgrow fear as we fill out this form. And I can only tell you that's what happens. Once you realize what your God would have you be, whatever that means to you, and whatever it means to me, you begin to get a sense of what you have to do in this life to deal with those things that you originally feared. And you no longer fear them. They become directions for you, how to handle life. And I can only tell you it works. You try it out. Now, you may not be able, as you fill this out the first time, to figure out what God wants you to be each time. And that's why step 5 is so helpful, because you then have someone you can do step 5 with and say, I couldn't figure this out, let's talk about it. And then you get some guidance. And invariably, when I do a step 5 with a person who is doing this for the first time, I've often assisted that person to come up with an understanding. I might say something like, well, in step 5, I don't know about you, but when I've dealt with a fear like that, this is what I've come up with. What does that sound like to you? Maybe you can come up with something different, but because I never dictate to anyone else what he or she should be, or what his or her God would have him or her do. But we do sort of brainstorm and come up with some ideas. So don't be too worried if you can't figure out what God would have you do at step 4. But you will find, amazingly enough, many, many things become clear to you. Generally, they come down to being the best X you can be, the best father you can be, the best person you can be, the best worker you can be, the best whatever. You're afraid of being laid off. These are tough economic times. What does God want you to be? The best worker you can be. What else can God want you to be? I throw this out, but a person who has an escape plan, an evacuation plan, who has something else in mind, a person who works things through, who maybe gets a better education, or I don't know what. But whatever it is, you get guidance from this and you outgrow your fear, because your fear turns into strategy. First of all, you separate the irrational fears from the rational ones, and then the rational fears become more than fears, they become concerns to be taken into account as you live your life. So it works. And that's the fear form, and it's a real simple form, and I can tell you it works wonders. The next form is the sex conduct form. I'd love to be able to read more, but I really don't have that much time. Read more in the book. But if you look at the forms and compare it to the book, I think you will see that this is what it is. That these forms do, in fact, parallel the book. Now again, sex conduct is, if you look in 1939, when people wrote about sex, they really meant relationships, a lot more than just what we mean by sex these days, which is basically physical. There's a book written by the great humorists E.B. White and James Thurber called Is Sex Necessary? And it's all about relationships between men and women and stuff like that. And sex conduct, I think, is far more than just a physical act. It is, in fact, relationships in which there is some attraction and really an imbalance of attraction between people. Because you're being asked to write down where you have harmed someone, not where relationships have been fine. I mean, I've had not that many relationships with women, aside from my wife before my wife, I should hasten to add. Most of them were not that healthy, and most of the girlfriends I had, ex-girlfriends I had, I put down. A few of them were relatively healthy, relatively even, balanced, and I didn't put them down because I don't think I hurt them and I don't think they hurt me. If they had hurt me, they would. I would have put them down if I had any concerns on the first list, on the resentment list, if I worried about them. And all of them were down. All my ex-girlfriends were down. But now I'm being asked on the sex conduct form to write down whom I hurt. Okay? Whom did I hurt? So I wrote down a number of my ex-girlfriends. I wrote down my wife because I certainly wasn't perfect in relationship to my wife. I also wrote down a few others. We have very close friends, a couple that we spent a lot of time with. Many, many years ago, when I first started filling out these forms, I realized that I flirted with the wife, and she flirted with me in front of our respective spouses. It was all supposedly all innocent and in good fun. But I felt when I wrote it down that even though I knew nothing would ever happen, we both loved our spouses, that this flirting, there was something going on there that I didn't like. So I put her down. As some of you know, in my life I have had an attraction to women who look like Mary Tyler Moore. Why? I finally figured out. Again, it's because if they could be attracted to me, then I'm worthy of being attracted. I'm attractive. I just figured that out. It took me a long time to figure out the obvious, a blinding flash of the obvious, but that's why. And there are people who look like Mary Tyler Moore who I've known in my life and whom I've been very diffident to. I haven't been able to talk to them easily. And so I put down one person whom I knew but didn't talk to very much. I put her down, even though I had no interest in being with her or having her as in a relationship. I put her down because there was something going on that I didn't understand. So I put her down. So I'm pretty broad in what I put down. And so I put them down. So the first thing I do, then you see in this form, there's little boxes. Whom did I hurt? And little boxes. So I put down the names of those people. Sadly, there was one person I put down whose name I didn't even remember. And that's very sad. Anyway, so you write down again column 1 all the way down. You might make 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 copies of this, depending on what your relationships were. I put down people I had designs on even though they had no designs on me. Because I felt I hurt them by not, as I analyzed it, by not treating them as human beings, by treating them as objects of desire. So that even if you've gone through life without that many relationships, you might put down people you had crushes on, or things of that sort. Because you're treating them in a way that's not a relationship. Okay? But you also put down people you've had relationships with that have had some hurt in them. And my wife, again, we love each other very much, but we haven't, know who has a perfect relationship, and there were times when I hurt her or I resented her, and she would be on my list. Then it asks, where was I? Selfish, dishonest, inconsiderate. And as I think I said to you earlier, inconsiderate is, in effect, the other side of self-seeking. If I'm self-seeking in relation to a person, it means I'm not thinking of that person, I'm thinking of myself in relation to that person. So inconsiderate is the other side of self-seeking. So you can see here that I've got selfish, dishonest, and inconsiderate / self-seeking. I've got the other 3 character defects that are isolated in the resentment form. I've done the fear already. Now I've got these same 3 things. And in effect, I can copy from what I've already written in the resentment form, although I might be even more detailed in specific situations. So I end up starting on this form with where I ended on the resentment form. Okay? And then I fill that out. Where was I? And I fill it out for all the people on this list, 2 or 3 or 4 pages worth. So I do column 1, column 2. Did I arouse? Oh, you see, in the forms as they are clear, individual, they're different from the book. The book actually, boy, I have to change this. The book actually somehow doesn't print up the words, did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Those boxes right beside there, under 3, should say, did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? And I see that I have to change those forms in the book to make sure that they print properly. Well, at any rate, that's the question. Did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? That's the question from the big book. And if you get the forms independently, or you get them off the web onto your computer, you'll see that they ask that question: did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, bitterness? And you put check marks there. And the check marks are basically, you might or might not put them. From the wife that I flirted with, for instance, did I arouse jealousy? I don't think so. I don't think either my wife or my very close friend, male friend, I don't think either of them at all felt jealous. Suspicion? Absolutely not. They were not suspicious. Bitterness? I thought there might be some in there. Sort of like, what's going on with those people, you know? So I put down, yes, I think I aroused bitterness there. Aroused bitterness. For my wife, again, I don't think it's appropriate for me to talk about my wife in particular, but I'll put together some wife to discuss that I might put down, you know, for a wife that friends of mine have put down, or that I've heard said in other meetings, you know. Where was I selfish, looked after my own needs instead of her needs? Where was I dishonest, not taking into account that she's not feeling well, that she hasn't been feeling well for a while? Inconsiderate, only thinking of my own needs. Okay? Something like that. Where was I at fault? What should I have done instead? This is the key question. We're trying to mold our ideals for the future. What should I have done instead? Well, for almost every girlfriend I put down on this list, the answer was I should have ended the relationship a lot earlier than it did end. For almost all of them. For my wife, it is always love her more, treat her better. Think of her needs. For the woman I flirted with, stop flirting. For the woman who looked like Mary Tyler Moore, treat her as a person and not as an object. And include her in conversations where you've been ignoring her up to now. Okay? I mean, some very basic, simple stuff that comes out when you think about what you should have done. Because if you see what your character defects are, then what you should have done is to avoid the things that brought out those character defects, right? Now, can you see what you're doing here? You're figuring out how to have good relationships and honest relationships and unselfish relationships and considerate relationships with people when there were difficulties when in difficult relationships where there was physical interests involved, physical attraction and imbalances involved. Those are hard relationships. Now you're getting a sense of how to have good relationships with everyone. It's a lot easier to have a good relationship with someone you're not attracted to or who's not attracted to you. You can have a good and honest relationship with them. Among the hardest relationships are the ones in which there's attraction involved. Your bodies are talking as well as your minds. Column 6, was each relation selfish or not? Put in a check mark. You've got these sex prayers. God, please mold my ideals and help me to live up to them. God, please show me what to do about each specific matter. These earnest prayers that are at the bottom are just there for future guidance, for future help. So that's pretty simple. The sex conduct form basically shows you how in difficult relationships you could have done better. You could have done something different. And now you're getting guidance for how you could be acting differently in the future in other relationships, not just in sex relationships, not just in attraction relationships. And that's it for step 4. Nothing more. How long do you think this is going to take you if you fill this out and you have even 180 resentments? I can tell you that by the time you get to selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened in your resentment list, you will be going, oh, this is the same as the one I just did. You know, you may list 10 friends on your resentment list. By the time you get to the second one, you realize that the second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth, all the way up to the 10th, they're exactly the same as the first, with maybe some variations. You'll end up using a lot of ditto, 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 yes, the same, see this one. You'll find out that your selfishness, dishonesty, self-seeking, and fear basically are of 3 or 4 different kinds. You want something out of life that you're not getting. You're not being honest about really why you want it. You're thinking of yourself and you're full of fear. Or you want something not to have happened that did happen, you're dishonest about it. Or you're not telling the truth where you should be telling the truth. or you've lied where you shouldn't have lied. These things become pretty clear to you. And you begin to see what your defects of character are. And then when you fill out the fear and the sex conduct, you see how quickly those go by and how easy they are to fill out. I know people who filled it out overnight. I wouldn't recommend that, but I know people who have. I know people who filled them out in a week. The general practice seems to be between 3 and 6 weeks. I got to tell you, if it's over 6 weeks, either you're in a coma or you're avoiding. Because even if someone else were in an accident and you had to take care of that person, you still would be able to find time to do this. It's really doesn't take that long to do. Contrast that with other methods of doing step 4, which other people have found very valuable. I think you'll see that this has a couple of advantages, which I recommend to you. I'm not suggesting you should change how you're doing it. Some of the methods that I've seen just take a long time to fill out, and people despair of ever finishing them. If you're asked a question like in our OA inventory handbook, which is not OA group conscience approved, it's just put up by the Board of Trustees. I think one question is, have you ever felt jealousy, disgust? Well, that's good for about 3 weeks for me. I felt a lot of jealousy in my life. And what do I do with it after I've written that down? I feel bad about myself. It doesn't isolate, it doesn't give me a sense of where I might go with that, whereas this way of doing it does. There are many, many ways of doing inventory, though I'm not going to go much further on other than to tell you that if you have not been able to finish your inventory, you'll be able to finish this one quickly. If your inventory makes you feel lousy about yourself, this will not. And those are 2 good reasons why it's worth trying if your step 4 isn't working for you. And it's direct from the big book, and so it has authority. It represents the considered opinion of 100 people. Now, it's not exactly the same as what they really did do, but what Bill did was extract the essence of what they did and do it in a way that someone could fill these things out and answer these questions without the need for someone to guide him or her. And so this was agreed to by the 100 AAers who existed at the time it was printed. No other book represents a set of directions like that in OA or AA literature. And so it's worth looking at. That's all I suggest. Big book gives you a few promises at the end of step 4 on page 70. Lots of good writing in here. I do recommend you read it, not just follow the forms, but I don't have time to do that. Bottom page 70, if we've been thorough about our personal inventory, we have written down a lot, that's a promise. We've listed and analyzed our resentments, that's a promise. We've begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. We've commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We've begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill toward all men, even our enemies, for we look on them as sick people. We've listed the people we've hurt by our conduct, are willing to straighten out the past if we can. In this book you read again and again that faith did for us what we could not do for ourselves. We hope you are convinced now that God can remove whatever self-will has blocked you off from him. If you have already made a decision, step 3, and an inventory of your grosser handicaps. Grosser there doesn't mean yucky. It means the big ones, the crude ones. You're not refining this. You're not waiting until it's perfect. You've made a good beginning. That being so, you swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about yourself. After about 6 weeks, my first sponsor phoned me up and says, "How you doing?" I said, "Oh, it's not ready yet." "Oh, aren't you ready?" I said, No, it's not perfect. He said, "It'll never be perfect. Just finish it. Just do it. Get rid of this stuff." And so I did. I didn't quite do it the way I now know how to do it, but I finished it. Sometimes it's important for you to make a step 5 appointment in anticipation of your finishing step 4. It just puts pressure on you. Because really and truly, if you do step 4 this way, you can get it done quickly. It's not as if it requires you tremendous psychotherapy to fill this out. This is not therapeutic. It's just practical. Everything in the big book is practical. It's designed to get you to a point where you learn how to act well, not that you think. It's getting you to the point where you just sort of understand what it means to give up your own will and to take on the will of your higher power. Okay, we're on to step 5 now. And we still are in our inventory, though. We've just isolated what our defects of character are, but we haven't done anything about them. And remember, the big book said you started the inventory by isolating them. You ended by getting rid of them. We haven't got rid of them yet. This step, the big book says, we're going to give you arguments, reasons why you should do step 5. Admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And they say, you know what? We'll give you one reason. If you don't, you'll die. Pretty good reason. They say, if you don't do this step, if you don't share with another human being the exact nature of your wrongs, you will relapse. You'll go back to drinking, or you'll go back to your compulsive eating. And therefore, you have to do it. And the only circumstances in which you can't do it is if you can't find someone who fulfills some very simple criteria for doing it. Now, the fact that we're in a town where OA exists means that you will always find someone you could do it with, so that excuse doesn't work. But I suppose if you lived in some western town in 1940 that only had a saloon in it, where the only people who came to it were gamblers who cheated at gambling, you might say, well, no, I can't find anyone yet, so you can put it off. But I just picked that out of the blue. I was thinking more of an 1890 town peopled by the bad guys in the westerns I used to watch. But I suppose there are some places where you won't be able to find anyone if you're on your own. But clearly, if there's a 12-step program around, there's someone you could give your step 5 to. So pages 72, 73, and 74 are basically why you should do it and how to pick a person if there's no one around. And they say you look for someone. Well, right at the bottom, they give you the criteria, right at the bottom of page 74. It is important, 1, I'm putting the 1, that he be able to keep a confidence. 2, that he fully understand and approve what we're driving at. 3, that he will not try to change our plan. So you go to people who you know will be able to keep things confidential, who you know will understand what you're trying to do, and who will not try to change your plan. I once had a person visit me who paid me $1, said, now you're my lawyer, you're on retainer, therefore this is confidential. And also said, you realize that when we're finished, I'll have to kill you. And this person was half joking, only half, because there was something very deep in that person's life that person was afraid to reveal. And didn't reveal for a number of hours until finally, just at the end, revealed it. And the beauty of what happened was the beauty of what happens all the way through step 5, which is that another person is able to say to a person who's confessing something dark and dirty, I know exactly how you feel, and I've done something very much like that. Or, although I haven't done that, I understand how I could have done that. And one of the great advantages of step 5 is that you're just not alone. You're giving it away to someone who understands it. So you realize that you're not alone. Another advantage of doing step 5 is that you're unburdening yourself. I mean, that's the first one. Confession is truly good for the soul. A number of religions build it into their worship or to their faith. It just is good for the soul. But it's also good to find another human being who can understand you. I like to do my step 5s with people in OA because they understand me better than anyone. But I've done them with other people as well. And I'll talk, when I get to step 10, I'll talk about sometimes what I do in specific situations in a step 10, which is step 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, done in the context of recovery. I'll talk about that either late today or tomorrow morning. You also begin to realize how uneventful your life really is compared to many others. Even if you've suffered a lot, it still is. It's happened to so many other people. You also get feedback, and I think that's really important. Sometimes the right kind of step 5 can give you some insight into something that you haven't been able to see for yourself. Step 5 is very helpful in a couple of ways. Sometimes we're too hard on ourselves, and sometimes we're too easy on ourselves. And either one of those can skew our sense of who we are and what our character defects are. I mean, when I first filled out these forms, I'm not sure that I was able to know exactly where every time I had been self-seeking or even frightened, and I might have left those areas blank on my resentment form. But by the time I did my step 5 with a person who had some experience in doing step 5, that person was able to say to me things like, well, you know, I don't know about you, but I might have felt this way or that way in terms of being self-seeking. How does that fit? Does that help you at all? Or are you maybe afraid of that? Like, not telling me what I would think, but giving me suggestions to think about. And I always ended up filling out every part of those forms by the time I finished step 5. And that's what happens when I do step 5 with people who are doing it for the first time.